Good morning again. The record will reflect the presence of counsel, the defendant, and the jury. Mr. Barker, you may make your closing argument.
Thank you. Yesterday, I asked the defendant's father if the defendant had not yet turned from the darkness. He said, correct. In this case, the defendant did a lot of things in the darkness. But that happened well before he committed murder in this case. You heard that he had dark feelings against Mennonites, resentments, grudges. And then in the cover of darkness, he committed horrific acts of violence against Sasha Krause, also a Mennonite, and a person who, in contrast to the defendant, worked at a place actually called Lamp Light. And in this case, during the trial, you heard evidence, you saw evidence that brought to light the defendant's actions, brought the truth. Now it's your opportunity as jurors to take that evidence and hold this defendant accountable for what he's done. And the way that you're going to do that is you're going to follow the jury instructions, the instructions the judge just read to you, because this is the law that you swore an oath to follow. And one of those instructions tells you to consider all the evidence in the light of reason, common sense, and experience. The state will promise that if you look at the evidence through this lens of reason, common sense, and experience, you will know beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty. Through this lens, let's talk about the evidence one last time. On January 12, 2020, we heard that the defendant was in the area of the Sunny Slope Mennonite Church. And while he was there, he was sending text messages to his brother, Sam Gooch. And they read, "Even this morning's surveillance was boring, a bunch of old people without much left to live for. Clearly not the Mennonite people we grew up with. Sad to say, another disappointment." While he was texting these things, he was surveilling the Mennonite church. Not just because he said he was doing that, but we know he was in that area from his AT&T records. The last text he sent in that conversation reads, "Well, I'm gonna head back to base." That was sent at 10:10 a.m. Now, we heard from Seb Dishman in this case, and he showed us how the defendant's AT&T records, those NELOS records, showed that the defendant had stagnant activity around the Mennonite church, the Sunny Slope Mennonite church. And he left that area at about 10:12 a.m., which corresponds nicely with that last text message he sent at 10:10 a.m. Now, the defendant had an interview with Detective Nagel that we saw, and you'll be able to watch that again if you like. And one of the things he told her is that I attend church quite a bit. This was one of many lies he told during that interview. There is zero evidence that the defendant was attending any churches during that time. The only thing he was doing was surveilling Mennonites during their Sunday service. He left that Mennonite area, that Mennonite church area, got back to his base. We saw from the DBIDS report, that gate report, that he showed up at 10:48 a.m. that morning, which again corresponds with those NELOS records. And why is that important? Well, as we'll talk about, those NELOS records show the defendant's activity. It shows where he was, and more importantly, when he was there. 6 days later, on January 18, 2020, the defendant gets to his car and he begins a drive. It was a 7-hour drive to a place he apparently had never been before. He apparently didn't have a reason to go to either, as we'll talk about. 8:30 in the morning he leaves. The surveillance video shows that. He begins to drive north at around 9 a.m. on the I-17. And then he takes a couple photos. And these are important again because they corroborate the accuracy of his AT&T records. He took one photo at 10:01 a.m. In that same area, his records show that he was there at 10:01 a.m. Again, corresponding nicely with that timestamp. Another photo as he's approaching Flagstaff at 11:09 a.m. Again, corresponding with his NELOS records, as Seb Dishman pointed out. And then he arrives or he nears Flagstaff. And what does he do? Well, he drives right through it. But this is what he told Detective Nagel. I was hoping that ski resort was still open, but they were closed due to coronavirus starting up. We're talking about something that happened in January 2020. Detective Nagel testified that the coronavirus, the COVID restrictions didn't happen until mid-March. There was no closure at the ski resort in Flagstaff. Defense counsel asked Detective Nagel, well, wasn't there a ski lift that closed that day, one of 6 that closed? Yeah, in the afternoon, but by that time the defendant was already in New Mexico. Another lie. This was the part of the interview where the defendant told Detective Nagel he hadn't traveled outside of Arizona. He said again, I stopped in Flagstaff for a while. The Needless records show that he made no stops in Flagstaff. He drove right through Flagstaff. That wasn't his objective. He wasn't trying to go to Flagstaff. He was going to Farmington. He continued driving through Arizona, and he ended up stopping Kayenta. We know this from the cell phone records because it shows that, again, that stagnation. We also know that he stopped at a McDonald's there, purchased a meal. That was at 1:42 p.m., again, corresponding with his AT&T records. Now, defense counsel asked Seb Dishman when he was here, and you can say, based on these records, that he went to that McDonald's, maybe even purchased a burger there. But can you say that he ate that burger? And this is where that instruction that I just read to you comes into play, where it says, use your reason, your common sense, and your experience. Is it possible that the defendant purchased a burger and just threw it away right after he bought it? So many things are possible. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about reasonable doubt. Use your common sense. He arrived in Farmington at around 3:55 p.m. We know that because he stopped at a speedway there. His financial record indicates that. His Needless record shows that as well. And the defendant had this exchange with Detective Nagel. She asked him, in the last 6 months, have you traveled out of state anywhere? Described how he had driven from Wisconsin down to Arizona, joined the Air Force. She asked anywhere else. He said, pretty much stayed in Arizona. Why was it important for the defendant not to say he had driven to New Mexico? Surely a trip he would have remembered, 7 hours away, the only time he'd ever been to New Mexico, because he knew what happened there. He knew what he did there. He was trying to do anything he could to conceal that fact. He arrived in the Farmington area at around 4:14 p.m. The detective asked him, you had mentioned earlier that you had family or friends or somebody that used to attend at Farmington. Correct, he said. So who was that? He replied, I can't remember the names. Mennonites back up north in Wisconsin that used to attend there. And we had the defendant's father on the stand yesterday, and one of you jurors asked a very important question. Did you know anybody in Farmington? What was his response? No. Another lie. Notice this pattern here, this triangular pattern. This was that stagnation that Seb Dishman talked about while the defendant was in and around the area of the Lamp and Light community. We talked about some of these areas. That one to the bottom there, that was that oil plant, power plant that we heard about. We even went to the screen and showed kind of that road, that dirt roadway. Seb Dishman pointed that out. This other area to the right shows that hillside that overlooks the area where that church was, where that community was. And of course, the one to the left where that yellow pin is, that's where the Mennonite church was in Farmington. That should look familiar because that's the same pattern we saw at the Sunny Slope Mennonite church. Again, where he was doing surveillance, suggesting that he was also doing surveillance at the Farmington church. Now, we have that drone footage that you saw in court, and you'll be able to watch it again during deliberations if you like. But it shows this one perspective. This is up in the area where a lot of those Needless clusters were, on that hillside looking down onto that Farmington community. And you can see one of the arrows pointing to the church, one pointing to where Sasha lived. A nice little spot to watch what was going on in that community. Now, you may see that and think, well, that's pretty far. I'm not sure what he could see from that distance. But we know he had binoculars in his car. When it was searched, even months later, he had binoculars right in his glove box. Was he a bird watcher? Was he a hunter? Or was he just surveilling people? Consistent with his own statement. During this time, he was also communicating with someone that you heard from in this trial, Sam Gooch. A lot of conversation, a lot of phone calls. In fact, more phone calls than he ever had with Sam Gooch. This day, for some reason, was significant. Over 90 minutes of conversation. But this is what he told Detective Nagel. She asked him, "You didn't tell anyone that you were planning to check out the Farmington church?" He said, "No, ma'am. I pretty much just called my family once every couple of weeks." False. He was talking to Sam that entire day. Now, defense counsel asked Detective Nagel, would you concede that maybe an event that occurred 3 months earlier, you might not remember everything? I'm paraphrasing, of course. She said, sure. But here's the thing. This was a very unique trip. Even setting aside the kidnapping and murder that occurred later, that we'll talk about, the defendant had never once been to Farmington, New Mexico. It was a 7-hour road trip for him. And he had never once spoken to Sam Gooch this much in a single day. This was a day that ought to stand out in his mind. We saw some of that surveillance video from the storage unit. Lieutenant Lurkins talked about how he corresponded those characteristics in that car to the car he recognized that was the defendant's in the parking lot of the Air Force Base. The timestamp there was 4:18 p.m. Again, corresponding with our AT&T records. And this is what the defendant said. I swung by the church about 2 to check the service times. Now he's off a couple hours. We'll talk about why that's significant, but the most important thing here is the phrase, I swung by the church. Just swung by, didn't spend any time there. Is that what happened? Of course not. We know from his AT&T records that he was there for a total of 3 hours and 31 minutes. That never came up in that interview with Detective Nagel. No, he doubled down. He said, I swung by the church just to check their sign. Now, you heard from Kurt Morris early in this case. Think back. Kurt Morris, one of the Mennonite men that lived in that community, said, at that time, there was no sign that showed any service times. It's another lie. And why is it important that the defendants say he just swung by around 2 p.m.? Again, he doesn't want to be in the area after 4, 5, 6, 7 p.m. because we know what happened after that time period. The defendant knows what happened. He's trying to avoid placing himself at the scene of an abduction. Just to clarify, Detective Nagel asked, doesn't sound like you were there very long. No, ma'am. Detective Nagel gave him every opportunity to come forward with the truth. Change his time, and he didn't. Now, during this time, he didn't just communicate with Sam Gooch, but he communicated with Kemper Kefley, who you heard from, one of the guys from the Air Force Base. And there was this exchange about going to a swap meet. Now, he told Detective Nagel he was talking to a friend who wanted to go hiking. That's not true. But the more significant part here is the fact that this was a communication that happened at 6:24 p.m. on January 18, 2020. Why is that significant? Because that is the very last communication he had with anybody over his phone until the next morning. 6:24 p.m. Why does that stand out? Because the next hour, an abduction would take place. He would not have any phone calls, no text messages, nothing. Even though the entire day he had constant communication with family and friends. You know what happened after 7? And we're saying after 7 because we heard a couple witnesses in this case talk about how they saw Sasha that day. Lily Petrie testified early in this case that she had dinner with Sasha. They had that conversation. And then Lily said she took a shower at 7. When she got out, didn't see Sasha again that night. Lucinda testified somewhere around 7:30. She recalls Sasha leaving the house. They both knew that Sasha was going to go pick up some books at the church. Nobody's looking at a clock. No one's looking at their watch. And so they're giving us estimates. But sometime after 7 p.m., Sasha, who was wearing that gray dress that we heard about, wearing that white police jacket, gets into her car and she drives down to the church. She parks her car in front of the church. And at this point, as you heard, it's dark, very dark. Not a lot of lights in that area. Sunset, if you recall, is at 5:23 p.m. that day in Farmington. We don't know exactly what this abduction looked like. And that's because the defendant, again, was doing this in darkness. There were no witnesses. Now we can make some reasonable inferences about what happened because there is no evidence of blood in this area. There's no evidence of struggle. And we know that Sasha was a strict adherent to the Mennonite faith and their tenets. She did not believe in violence. She believed in being a pacifist. Is it possible the defendant pulled a gun on her and told her just to get in the car? Sure. Is it possible he just threatened her with violence if she got into the car? Sure. But there's no evidence that there was any kind of altercation at this point. What we do know is that the defendant and Sasha, in the same car, started heading back west toward Arizona. And we know this again from those records, from the AT&T records. Not just the defendant's, but also Sasha's. And you'll recall from Seb Dishman this unusual shape here. This is the range that these cell sites have, showing where someone could be in that time frame. And they could be anywhere in that area. And you'll notice that the times that the defendant's phone is hitting those towers is very similar to the time that Sasha's phone is hitting those towers. Now I asked Seb Dishman, if I'm in the same car as someone else, could our phones be communicating with the same tower and hitting off at different times? And he said, absolutely. So there may be a minute or two difference, but they're traveling in the same direction during that same time frame. Until, as we learned, Sasha's phone just disconnects from the network altogether. 10:58 p.m. is the last time we see Sasha's phone. Either it's thrown out the window, destroyed, batteries go out, unclear, but it's not connecting anymore with that network. And this tower, even though it's in Colorado, covers a wide area in that Four Corners area, and it covers the area of Highway 64, which is the route the defendant took to go back to Arizona. And it's hitting at the same time his NELOS records indicate he's traveling that direction. Once the defendant arrives in Arizona, he's traveling south on the 89, and then he makes a detour. Different than his route to Farmington. At 12:16 a.m., he heads onto that, what's been called the Loop Road, or other names. It's that road that goes to the National Monument, Sunset Crater. And Detective Nagel asked him, because she knew from the cell phone records where he'd gone. You don't remember stopping anywhere? No, ma'am. We know he stopped there. We know that from his records. And here's what's important, is the fact that of all the cell phone providers and all those cell sites, the ones in Farmington, the Four Corners area, in the Sunset Crater area, there's only one device, one cell phone that hits off every one of those towers during this time frame. And it's the defendant's cell phone. He spent some time there. He makes that drive that you heard a reverse C, kind of that loop down to the south and heading back to the highway. And then he makes a decision to turn around and head back east. Now, it's unclear why he decided to do that. It's possible that he was looking for a very remote location where he was going to commit this murder. And by the time he's showing up towards the highway again, he decides this is not remote enough and heads back to the east. And we see that needless hit about a mile from where Sasha's body is later recovered. Why don't we see it any closer? Well, we heard from Sev Dishman about that. Again, Detective Nagel asks, gave him many opportunities. Did you ever stop and then check out any touristy things? Couldn't be more specific. Did you stop at the Sunset Crater? No, ma'am, I was trying to get back to the hike. What hike? 1:13 a.m. is when he's there. We heard from Detective Nagel, Lieutenant Lurkins, others, that this area where Sasha's body was recovered had no cell phone coverage. They had to drive 3 miles to make a connection. So we don't see the defendant's cell phone during that period. 1:13 a.m., which is near where Sasha's body is located, we don't see it show up again until 3:33 a.m. Is it possible he just turned off his phone? Maybe. More likely is the fact that when he's in the area where he's committing the murder, his phone is no longer connected to the network at all. We're not getting those NELOS hits anymore. And how long is he in that area? 2 hours, 21 minutes. But this is the conversation he had with Detective Nagel. Is there anywhere else you would have stopped? No, I don't believe so. It's a long drive. I was trying to get back before it got dark. Well past dark at this point. 3:30 a.m. is when he starts heading back to the highway. And during that time, that 2 hours, 21 minutes, the defendant's committing crimes that he's now charged with. At some point, he duct taped Sasha's wrist together. We don't know when that happened. We know that when her body was found, it was still tied that way, bound together. And he bashed her head and shot her in the back of the head. We heard from the medical examiner that these injuries were acute. There's no healing present, and that her heart was beating still because there was hemorrhaging at these wound sites. And this suggests that they happened close together, or in the same time frame as he talked about. Asked the medical examiner, this blunt force injury, is that consistent with possibly being hit with the back of a rifle, butt of a rifle? Yeah, among other things. Picture in your mind what this must have looked like. Sasha being marched from the car, hit in the back of the head, crumpled to the ground. Defendant shoots her in the back of the head with his .22 caliber rifle. Then leaves her in the dirt, face down, where she wouldn't be discovered for weeks later. Medical examiner recovered that bullet that we've heard about. Was it damaged? Of course. Went through her skull. But it was still suitable for comparison, as we'll talk about. We heard from 2 experts the last couple days, experts in firearm examination, ballistics comparison. And there was some dispute, but they agreed on a couple things. One, that this bullet was suitable for comparison. It wasn't so deformed, so damaged that they couldn't make a comparison. The other thing is that the defendant's rifle could have fired this bullet. The defense expert isn't excluding that bullet. He's inconclusive. Lisa Pelosa, the state's expert, says the defendant's rifle fired this bullet. So there's somewhat of a dispute here. Let's talk about the differences in their testimony and their experience. Lisa Pelosa, 25 plus years of experience, thousands of cases under her belt. She's a state expert. She doesn't get a bonus, doesn't get an extra paycheck if she finds a comparison, makes that identification. There's no stakes for her. She sees it, calls it how she sees it. Defendant's expert, 12 years of experience. Remember how I asked him about if experience matters? It didn't matter as much to him, right, because he didn't have as much experience. 1,300 cases, according to him, at TBI, which is the state-run facility he was at before he went private. And he's a professional witness. He gets paid to testify. Now, in an industry, as the defense mentioned, that's subjective, a field that's subjective, bias matters, right? Because if you're making a subjective determination, the influences, what's influencing you, matters. And we had this exchange, I believe it was yesterday, it seems like it was longer. I asked Mr. Warren, wouldn't it show some level of bias if an examiner were to tweak a report to satisfy the requesting agency? He said yes. And then I asked him, or I pointed out rather, you emailed defense counsel and said, I'm happy to tweak and change it to your liking, referring to the report he sent to Mr. Griffin. Now, Mr. Griffin clarified that there was no tweaking after that was sent. But that's a credit to Mr. Griffin, not to Eric Warren, who proposed that he could tweak it to his liking. He agreed. In the end, even though you have these somewhat conflicting experts, in the end, this is what you have to go back to. You consider the evidence in light of reason, common sense, and experience. And part of that instruction, let me just read the first part of this phrase. This is page 16. You consider the reasonableness of the witness's testimony when considered in light of all the other evidence. Which explanation fits the evidence in this case? Lisa's. Lisa Pelosi's explanation fits the evidence in this case. Now, going back to the timeline, we heard that Sasha's body was left there. You have a report from the Weather Service, if you want to look at it, showing that the temperatures in that time frame, we're talking January, February, were cool, were dry. Her body was well preserved during that time frame until it was found. After the defendant left that area, he went to his base, and he checks in at 6:53 a.m. at the gate, and he shows up at his doorstep just after 7 a.m. And he told Detective Nagel, I got back around when it got dark, like 8 or 9. You're getting home at 8 or 9 p.m. on Saturday night, she asked. He says, correct. He's off 10, 11 hours. Why would he be so far off? Again, he wants to avoid putting himself at a crime scene. She allows him to extend that time. He says, could have been 1 or 2. She says 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. is pretty different. You want to stick with that? In other words, you ready to tell the truth? He wasn't ready. He said, yes, ma'am. Now, why is that time frame important? Well, right after he gets inside his dorm, he texts Kemper Kefley at 7:26 a.m. This was the first communication since the last one at 6:25 p.m. previous day. Good 11 hours that he's, 12 hours. Make that 13 hours. That's why I'm a lawyer, not a mathematician. 13 hours gap where there's no communication at all with anybody. And he texts this right as he gets inside. And then what does he do 3 minutes later? He goes back onto his phone and he deletes his location history from his Google account. And for which time period? The time period when he would have been committing the murder. You have an instruction that the judge read to you about concealment of evidence. You may consider concealment of evidence when determining the defendant's guilt. This shows that the defendant was trying to cover his tracks, trying to keep everybody in the dark. Keeps trying to do it. In fact, you see just minute after minute, he wants to make sure that's working. Delete, delete. And finally, he just deletes his entire location history. That's what 1970 refers to, way back before that phone was even invented. 2 days later, he heads back to the crime scene. Shows up there around 9:40 p.m. Again, his phone disappears for a period of time. He's there around 25 minutes until it reappears, and he heads back down to his base. No detours along the way. No detours on the way back. Went straight to the area where he had just committed a murder. Now, it's anyone's guess what he was doing there. Not clear if he found Sasha's body again, if he did, what he did with it. But he did return to the crime scene. Detective Nagel, have you gone to Flagstaff any more than that one time? No, ma'am. Sure? So after this New Mexico trip, you have not come back up to Flagstaff again, is that right? His response, not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. Who else would know? Now, after Detective Nagel told the defendant, I knew and I know that you went to Flagstaff, He changed his story again. Oh, well, I may have taken a drive. The defendant, again, is trying to conceal his tracks. And when he gets back at 12:39 a.m., after midnight now, on that day, he again goes onto his phone and he deletes his location history. For which times? For the time he went back to the crime scene. It's important for him, for people not to know that he was in the area of Sunset Crater. That's why he didn't say anything to Detective Nagel. That's why he kept deleting his location history. A month later, Cynthia Schultz is out camping. And you heard her testify in this case, and she was emotional about what she saw, as you would expect. And it's hard because we're in this courtroom that's safe, and we're hopefully sitting in comfortable chairs, and it's hard to imagine what this must have been like for Cynthia. But she sees Sasha's body. And she tells the police that she had found a body. And the police get up there and they find her wrists bound together. And the next day, they put out a press release. We found Sasha. February 22nd. The next day, the day after that, the defendant decides he needs to do something with his gun. He needs to clean his car. He texts Kemper Kefley again. Hey, can I put my tools in your truck for a couple hours? Need the space in the car. One of the tools, he didn't tell Kemper Kefley this, but one of the things he wanted to relocate was that rifle. So he went to the car service and he got every interior detail service you could get. And during that time, he's texting with Sam Gooch, the person who came in to testify in this court and tried to cover up for his brother. I'm getting my car done right now. Sam, where'd you put your tools? Buddy's truck with topper. Sam, could always spray down with disinfectant spray when they're done too. A strange thing to suggest. Defendant, they're doing fine detail shampoo and steam clean. You heard from Aaron Higgins, the DNA expert. Steam, heat, kills DNA. What else kills DNA? Bleach. That same day he buys liquid bleach. And then, after being told by Kemper Kefley that you can't have a gun on base, which of course the defendant knew because there were signs posted everywhere, as George Letty told us, he took that gun to Jeremiah Levesque's house, off base, to store for him. And you remember that exchange he had with Jeremiah Levesque? Jeremiah said he was on the phone with somebody, came out, the defendant really wanted to show him his clean car and asked him to sit inside of it. He asked him to sit inside his car. Transfer DNA. He leaves the gun there. And then what does he do that night? Just like he had on previous occasions, anytime he's trying to conceal something, he wants to go into his Google account, delete the location history, release location for the time period that he would have relocated that gun, gotten that car detailed. Concealing evidence. Less than a month later, you see this exchange in his text record with his brother, Jake Gooch. Brother who is a police officer, says, just gave a Mennonite a ticket. Defendant's response, fuck yes. I hope you treated him like shit. Jake Gooch, I did, LOL. Defendant, haha, fuck yeah. Jake Gooch, I coughed on him so he would spread corona to the wedding they were going to, LOL. Defendant, haha, that's fucking hilarious. This is not the exchange someone has when they love Mennonites, when they want to attend a Mennonite church. This is someone who is relishing in the pain and suffering of another Mennonite, someone he doesn't even know. It's like Sasha. After he's arrested, he has this conversation with Sam Gooch. Wipe my phone and the SD card. Fortunately for the defendant, it wasn't done. We have his text record. You have his text record. You heard about it. In this case, as you heard, the state need not prove motive, but you may consider motive in reaching your verdict. In other words, for the crime of first-degree murder, there is no element of that offense that requires you to determine why he did it. Sometimes we won't ever know why someone does something like this. Dark is incomprehensible. Evil acts are sometimes hard to understand. But you can consider motive, things like the fact that he was surveilling Mennonites, offensive texts about Mennonites. He told Kemper Catholic, someone he'd only known for a few months, he didn't like what his old church was doing. And you heard Sam Gooch testify reluctantly that the defendant had a grudge. That's what he told the police, a grudge against the Mennonites. We heard about the credibility instruction. Let me talk about that for a minute. This phrase here, in evaluating testimony, you should use the test for truthfulness that people use in determining matters of importance in everyday life. We talked about in jury selection, what types of things would you look at to determine if someone's telling you the truth or if they're lying? Remember that discussion? And people talked about if they're contradicted, right? They have a memory of it. They're consistent, their demeanor, their body language. We talked about the defendant's contradictions. We talked about his reason or his motive to lie. Let's talk about his demeanor. During this interview, you saw it, and it's hard to see. I know you're watching from a distance, and there's just those couple frames you can see. There's a jarring moment in this interview where the defendant has this exchange with Detective Nagel. It's kind of boring in here. What? It's kind of boring in here. And where? In this room. She's asking him about a homicide, and he's bored. And when she asks him if he had anything to do with killing Sasha, he replies unemotionally, "No, ma'am," almost as if he was expecting a question. Consider all the evidence in light of reason, common sense, and experience. Ladies and gentlemen, when you show up into a courtroom, it's very unnatural. It's different than how you communicate outside of court, right? If you were asking someone to tell you about this case, they would just tell you about it. They wouldn't be calling witnesses one at a time, sometimes out of order. There wouldn't be interruptions with objections. So when you come into court, sometimes there's this tendency to think, I got to make my thinking different. I got to accept information differently because it's so unnatural in here, it's very technical. And don't get me wrong, the technical aspect of this is important because it keeps things orderly and fair. But it may give you the impression that you can't use your common sense, that you got to change your thinking. And this instruction says absolutely not. This is the only way the system works, is if you as jurors bring in your common sense. We don't panel 12 judges or 12 lawyers to make these determinations. We want people from the community with their reason, common sense, and experience to render verdicts. By all accounts and what we've heard in trial, Sasha Krause was a light to her family, her community, light to the world. And this defendant snuffed it out. We won't be able to bring that light back. There's nothing we can do to stop Sasha from going to that church, prevent the defendant from doing what he did. There's something that you can do today to hold him accountable. That's why the state's asking you to find the defendant guilty on all charges.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. Mr. Griffin, would you like to make your closing argument?
Judge, can we approach?
Sure you can.
Just need a minute to set up. Thank you.
Certainly.